First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that we're on, which is the Gadigal Nation, and also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Great. So here I'm just here to talk about NAAKPA. We're actually a cooperative of 7 Aboriginal corporations harvesting bushfoods across northern Australia. That's a photo of country just south of Darwin, near the WA border in the Northern Territory. We've got Kakadu plum trees there at the front, with a eucalypt, sort of a woodland eucalypt with cycads and palm understory. There's really nice native grevilleas sort of covering the ground as well, just through that area. There is a proposal to clear all that and put fields of watermelons in as well, which would be a real shame. But first of all, to give you a bit of a... Oh, that's the wrong title there. Just to give you an idea of the spread of Kakadu plum. So that map is taken from the Living Atlas of Australia, and that gives you an idea of the spread. These are only the samples that have been recorded. The tree is actually very, very prolific. The fruit is used mainly in cosmetics and nutraceuticals. And basically in 2019, Kakadu plum and about a dozen other native foods were estimated to be valued at about 81 million in 2019, and that's anticipated to double by 2025. The Kakadu plum sector was about 4.3 in 2019, that's at the retail end, and that's expected to jump to about 9.5 by 2025. What's interesting is that of that study that was done in 2019, only about 15% of actual producers of those dozen or so bush foods are actually Aboriginally owned. The rest were not Aboriginal owned, and that's a big concern for us because we're primarily an Aboriginal organisation. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the sector, basically historically what's happened is that a lot of the land was actually taken from a lot of Indigenous nations, and a lot of it was actually cleared to make way for mainstream agriculture. So the exotic species that which make up our main food system. But over time, there has been a lot of interest from the agricultural sector, mainly in native foods, quite simply because of the effects on the environment, the actual greater stability, I guess, of native species to actually grow in this environment. The other big player in that is that around jurisdictions and legislations. So a lot of native resources come under state and territory environmental regulations, which is a little bit different from other agricultural products. And then obviously we've got the Food Standards Code, and we've also got the TGA, and they're really both sort of follow the agricultural sort of exotic species. And there is a little bit of a challenge around trying to deal or sort of investigate some issues around food safety, as well as medicinal efficacy of a lot of native foods. Meanwhile, all of this is going on, you've got Indigenous communities in the mix, and they really have a whole food system that's very, very old. That's actually different from mainstream agriculture. A lot of it relies on wild harvest. It's multi-species environments, very high on biodiversity. And then they've also got different governance systems too around that. So they have traditional owners that own land, and then they have custodians, or they're called jungai, that are actually involved in the maintenance of some of these food and medicinal resources. And usually when we talk about access and management of these resources, both of those stakeholder groups need to be considered within the context of a lot of Aboriginal societies. Usually what happens though is within our main Western system, the focus is really on traditional owners rather than just the cultural custodians. So what usually happens is there's quite an imbalance in terms of cultural authority and those sorts of issues. So the other thing, of course, that affecting Indigenous people is that they've had their land dispossessed. So a lot of these foods, the environments that a lot of these foods are produced in has actually disappeared due to colonialism. They're a lot more prevalent up north through the Northern Territory, northern Western Australia, quite simply because those environments haven't actually been cleared. Whereas if you go down to, say, places like Victoria or even New South Wales, there's large sections that have been cleared. And I guess the issues for traditional owners and a lot of those cultural custodians is slightly different when it comes to bush foods. Another point that's really important is that sort of Indigenous sovereignty was never really ceded. So, and that's a big issue for a lot of Aboriginal nations. So, you know, the old saying of always was and always will be is really relevant to them. Historically, what's happened is research in the native food sector has really been driven by universities and other research organisations, so research development corporations. So what usually happens is that they tend to come in with their own perspectives about what's important and what they want to achieve. Usually the data that they collect is actually dispersed, so there's no real central database where it's all pulled together. And the big issue, I guess, for our stakeholder group is that they don't actually have access to that information either. So that's sort of the historical way that's actually that research in this space has actually proceeded, and it still tends to be the prevalent or predominant approach that a lot of researchers do take. So what we are trying to do is actually try and switch the model in terms of how we engage with research organisations to try and make it more Indigenous-led, to actually research topics and issues in relation to these bush foods and medicines. It's actually important to a lot of these communities. So it's quite a different approach, and I guess that's one of the areas that we're really focused on. But a key issue around this is what they call Indigenous cultural intellectual property. And it is quite important, particularly in international conventions. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was sort of Australia signed and ratified, and it resulted in the EPBC Act, or the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999, and it also led to a lot of states and territories also harmonising environmental legislation. So those sorts of benchmarks, and within that there is something called the Nagoya Protocol that focuses on the idea of access and benefits. So they do recognise traditional knowledge and the Indigenous contribution to maintaining a lot of these resources in the natural environment. The other one is the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And then also WIPO has recently put in a treaty dealing with patents that are associated with traditional knowledge and genetic resources. So all of these are international conventions, and I think especially when Australia is part of the international community, especially when it comes to food exports, you know, we're sort of recognised as a well-developed nation that has a lot of these standards and benchmarks, and so it's really important to recognise the importance of traditional knowledge and that sort of Indigenous contribution. So I guess in that sense, certification is really, really important. So I had a look at current databases on bush foods at the moment. So at the moment, the estimate is that there's about 5,000 different species that Aboriginal nations have used for food and medicine. And I had a look at the Australian Food Composition Database just on the Food Standards website, and it was actually quite interesting because wattle seed was recorded, and wattle seed is becoming a major industry, not only for Indigenous producers but also non-Indigenous producers. And it was interesting that they only had data sourced from 3 suppliers. Davidson plum's another common known species, so there was the data was sourced from one sample that was brought from a shop in Sydney in 2005. So it gives you a bit of an idea of how much data is actually there that's actually being used as a reference point. The other area is there's a nutrition panel calculator, and that has 35 species. And I think a lot of this was done through some research development corporations previously. What's interesting about this, they've sort of been done in a big blanket approach in terms of a project to collect all of these samples together and then test them. I've got some photos there on the top right, is a Syzygium subculture or a bush apple, which is actually not listed in the native species. There are some close cousins, some other Syzygium species, but NAAKPA is actually harvesting those, and we are actually preparing to export them as well. So it's interesting that we don't have much data there in the nutritional panel calculator that relates to that. The middle one is Kakadu Plum. So Kakadu Plum is listed here, and there's been lots of testing done on Kakadu Plum. And the bottom one is a Kurrajong species, or it's called a bush peanut, so they actually taste a little like peanuts. Again, that's not actually on the nutritional panel calculator as well. So there's a real disjoint in the way this emerging industry is developing and evolving, and actually increasing its production methods to scale, versus the database of known nutritional profiles that are available to regulators. So there is a gap that really does need some updating. So I've just taken, these are some more of the native species as well. So I've got some, that table's taken from the nutritional panel calculator as well. But I've also got some photos down the bottom there. It's the bottom one is a common bush radish that's actually found that's pretty regular. Then the middle one are green ants, and green ants are quite popular. I'm not sure, they've been popularised by a gin. People have been putting them into bottles. But green ants are quite commonly eaten through Southeast Asia. They are the same species, but they're not green. I think they're brown or a different colour. So Australia just has unique green ants. But again, that's another, that is a bush food. It's also an insect, I guess. But there is interest in actually, from importers, in actually shipping that overseas as well. And then we've got a photo there of the cycad, or the cycad nut, which again is a traditional food. And again, that's not listed. It does have some cyanides associated with it, and there is a particular way that it is actually treated before it's actually consumed. So I guess as an emerging industry, and particularly from an Indigenous perspective, we really are looking at trying to canvass for some more support, particularly around setting up some benchmarks for testing some of these bush foods. And obviously, once we do have a suite of test results, they can form a bit of a benchmark that can actually contribute to a certification standard in terms of how these foods are actually processed and brought to market. Some of the things we were thinking are things like heavy metal screens for particular residues. It's something that we do at the moment for all of our producers to make sure that we are meeting some of those requirements. I think it's Schedule 19 in the Food Standards Code, that we are meeting those requirements and making sure that the food's safe there. Obviously, updates to the nutritional panel. There hasn't really been much done in allergen screen testing either, so for some of these foods, particularly foods that have a high fatty acid or lipid content. And obviously cyanide testing as well. So there are a few foods that have cyanide, so the cycad nut, wattle seed is another one too that needs to be treated before it's actually consumed, so they usually heat it up. And then aflatoxin testing is another one as well, so that we're particularly concerned about, because a lot of our growers are in sort of northern Australia, which is a tropical environment, so perfect environment for your yeasts and moulds, and so that is a big issue. So Kakadu plum is listed as a TGA ingredient, and it has a very, very specific prescribed processing method, but from our experience, what we've seen in the marketplace for Kakadu plum, there really is no real indication of that. So people aren't saying this is made to TGA specifications. Here's some Kakadu plum powder, which is the mainstream form. So which raises a bit of concern as to, because the most common form that Kakadu plum powder is produced includes the seed as well, which is not part of the TGA prescribed process. So I guess our concern is that potentially there could be people selling the wrong type of Kakadu plum powder as something that could be prescribed for as a a medical ingredient. So again, that's not very well regulated either. So I guess for our stakeholders, we're really interested in compound research, looking at some of the some of the compound characteristics of these foods, which is pretty much what a lot of the universities have been doing, and which comes under the common heading of bioprospecting. And then also we've also got a bit of a challenge in actually helping our stakeholders understand some of these tests. I remember a few years ago, the first time we got results back from NMI around fatty acid profiles and just the chains of fatty acids, and trying to explain to people, the differences between them, or even amino acid profiles, or there's so much there, and actually trying to build that capacity so they actually understand it a bit more. And so when it comes to the actual production of these foods, they're in a much better position to manage any potential harmful effects that these foods might have to consumers. Indigenous certification really does matter. The FAO talks about food fraud, and they identified food fraud as intention plus deception to gain undue advantage. There's many ways of doing that. So we've done some work with ANSTO around testing some overseas produced Kakadu plum powder, which is quite unusual, and extracts, because as far as we know, Kakadu plum's only available in Australia. And we found that they were actually probably something else that's been juiced up with a lot of vitamin C. But food fraud in the bush food sector, there's a whole lot of things. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the term black cladding. So it's not only within bush foods, but it's within the whole Indigenous sort of space. A government initiative, both federal and state government initiatives around Indigenous procurement, have led to a lot of businesses trying to market themselves as Indigenous owned to actually get access to those procurement opportunities. And black cladding really involves putting, Indigenous people or Indigenous designs or images to present themselves as being Indigenous. There's also things like blackwashing, which is very similar to greenwashing, whereby claims are made about sourcing from Indigenous communities or Indigenous organisations, or supporting them when they're not true. And then obviously there's issues around fake ingredients. So I guess there are a number of initiatives for Indigenous certification. So Supply Nation really looks after the Indigenous procurement policy, so they have a big register on Indigenous organisations. The Victorian Federation of Traditional Owner Corporations has developed a strategy around native food and botanicals. We're just about to put out a paper on Indigenous certification in the bush food sector from our context, which is really driven around the idea of focused on principles rather than any set certification rules, because it's actually quite difficult to get traditional owners, custodians together within the right context, and it takes a fair bit of time. So the National Farmers Federation is has got a project on Indigenous credentials, so they're trying to develop a framework. And we suspect that sort of ties in with a much larger strategy, I guess, to market Australia and Australian agriculture under an Indigenous sort of a theme or a brand to the rest of the world. So I guess it's about trying to get that image right, because there are all sorts of issues with Indigenous communities in Australia. So it's about balancing what we're saying internationally with what's actually happening on the ground and getting that right. The FAO has also developed a really useful guide on Indigenous food labelling as well. So the biggest challenge, I guess, in any certification system is actually talking to the right people, and that's really being able to get the right traditional owners together with the right custodians, and actually having them involved in the system. So, because at the moment, I think a lot of what's happened is that we've got a Western system, and a lot of the Indigenous cultures are sort of being forced into that sort of into that system, and it doesn't quite fit. So it is quite a complex environment. So just on the last slide, I thought I'd leave some opportunities for questions. Is that okay? Yeah. So again, that's quite a mature tree there. That's about a 30-year-old tree. Again, that's from Wadair as well. But happy to take any questions.
What are the current threats facing the bush foods industry that are most prevalent at the moment?
It's an interesting question. So I think one of the big issues is that I think overall is that a lot of our industries are getting exported. So lemon myrtle is probably the biggest native food. So I think it's worth about 12 million in 2019. So lemon myrtle has about 3 different cultivars, and they've actually been exported. So lemon myrtle's been grown in China, in Malaysia, and what that's doing is outscaling production to Australia. The other big one is finger limes. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the caviar limes or the Australian finger limes. So the cultivars for that originally came from a farm near Byron Bay, and they were registered. They're registered with the cultivar license, or there's a cultivar register in Australia for cultivars, but they haven't actually registered for plant breeders' rights on them, and they've actually exported these cultivars. And there's all sorts of growers, say in California, I think there's about a dozen growers, and they've actually taken that cultivar and developed their own cultivars, and then they've applied for plant breeders' rights. So they're actually making money off those cultivars from, we haven't actually done it. And obviously the macadamia nut, I can't remember its traditional name, but macadamia is actually a Western name. That again was taken offshore in the late 19th century. And that industry is worth more than $1 billion globally, US, and I think Australia's only produces a quarter or less than a quarter of that. I think South Africa is the biggest producer. So in total, I think nationally, I think that the real threat is that these industries, all of these native species that are unique to Australia will probably go offshore well before the industry is actually really solidified in Australia. That's the biggest threat. Yeah, and I think the issue for our stakeholders in terms of Indigenous growers is that they're really missing out, because it's really, they don't really have a lot of they don't have the resources, they don't have the technical resources, they don't have the financial resources to really commercialise a lot of these products at scale. They're still using them traditionally on country. And I think what we're trying to encourage, and we're lobbying Department of Agriculture in terms of recognising wild harvest as a sustainable form of food production. And if we look at say one community, Wadair, where I've taken these photos from, they can produce up to 12 tonnes plus a year, which has a farm gate value of about 350,000, which is roughly about the size of a middle-sized farm. So they can produce that volume if it's needed. But really, in terms of agricultural and food production, it's still very much set in that traditional broadacre cropping or intensive horticulture, rather than that sort of wild harvest. And the great thing about wild harvest is that the resources are already there. They just have to get more efficient at actually collecting them.
All right. Thank you once again.